welcome back. Today I'm going to give my poetry recommendations for people who are either new to the genre and don't know where to start with finding what they like, or if you already like poetry but you know you prefer poems and poets that are a little bit more accessible and straightforward. My number one recommendation for when you're trying to find out what you like is just to pick up an anthology, because that way, even if you only end up liking one poem in an anthology, you can go and you can find that poet's full collection or collections, and that's just a place to start. I particularly recommend Sleeping on the Wing. This is a collection of 19th and 20th century poetry, ending with a couple of contemporary living poets, but it's the big names. It's the people you've heard of. We got Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Yeats, William Carlos Williams, D.H. Lawrence, Rilke, Ezra Pound. And for all of them, it has kind of their greatest hits, right? So T.S. Eliot, they have the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and for John Ashbery, they have the instruction manual and the painter. So it's this is the greatest hits. It's a very good place to start, and I actually do find a lot of the poems they've chosen to be really accessible for beginners. My second recommendation might be a little less expected, which is to listen to poetry being read aloud. So historically, of course, poetry is a very oral genre, and to some extent it still is. I'm going to link in the description the website that I use primarily to listen to poetry being read aloud by the poets themselves. It's called Pen Sound with 2 N's because it's from UPenn. A lot of modern poets, contemporary living poets, also have videos here on YouTube of them reading their poetry, which is great, but I like that Pen Sound collection because it has some more classic poetry. You can even listen to William Butler Yeats reading in his just very shaky, weird voice, which is more like singing than speaking, really.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made.
I will arise and go now. Can you imagine? Can you imagine reading your poetry like that? I think listening to poetry read aloud can make it more accessible. It can also give you access to the tone that the writer intended. So I had this experience once where I saw Chen reading from his collection, When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities, and I had already read that collection, but I hadn't realized just how funny it was until he read it aloud, because something about the tone was kind of being lost. You can even queue up one of these poems on the Pen Sound website and then pull it up online and follow along. I just think it makes it easier to really understand the poem. Plus, with recordings, you can go about your day, you can put it on, do some yoga, fold your laundry. When I was in college, I used to like to walk around campus with poetry because I'm an intellectual. So now let's get into my specific recommendations. As I said, I really think you should just get an anthology and find what you like, because accessibility is a tricky concept, and ultimately what's going to be accessible to you is what is meaningful to you and what resonates with you, and I just really can't tell you what that's going to be. But I can give you some specific recommendations beyond probably what you heard about in high school. High school poetry is just so boring. You just talk about Emily Dickinson, you read Robert Frost to death. It's all just very old, and so I really want to talk about some modern poets, but I am going to start with more classic poets and the ones that I think might be accessible to a beginner. So the 3 classic poets I'm going to recommend, they're all in that Sleeping on the Wing collection, are T.S. Eliot, William Carlos Williams, and Allen Ginsberg, and they all offer something different. So again, everyone's different, and I'm trying to tailor to different types of readers. So T.S. Eliot is very slice of life, just beautiful descriptions of everyday stuff that's very transcendent. I personally can't imagine anyone not loving the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but that's just me. It's a personal fave, and I think that's a great place to start. That was one of the first poems I ever really enjoyed, personally. Next, William Carlos Williams, I'm recommending for the simplicity, the economy of language. If you tend to like shorter poems with shorter lines, his are pretty straightforward and very, very beautiful. Finally, Allen Ginsberg, I think thematically is relatable and enjoyable to a lot of people, especially, of course, if you like beat writers in the realm of fiction. If you're a Kerouac fan or whatever, if you like that time period, it can be fun. You do have to deal with some meandering, long lines, almost stream of consciousness. I would actually not recommend starting with Howl. I guess that's his magnum opus, but it's not the most accessible. It's very long. My favorite Ginsberg poem is actually America. That's one I really love hearing read aloud. When he reads it aloud, it's very, very funny. I also like A Supermarket in California. that's the extent of my sort of classic older recommendations, because I really just think you should buy this book and find the classic poets that resonate with you. Now let's get into more contemporary modern poets. These are my faves. This is where we're going to get into the stuff that I really love and can rave about. I've talked about most of these collections before, but now I'm going to give you my explanation as to why I think they're good for beginners. Starting with Jennifer Espinosa, and specifically my recommendation would be this collection, There Should Be Flowers. Jennifer Espinosa, for me, is like my holy grail of balance between accessibility and poetic language. Her poems are very personal, very confessional, extremely relatable. She's a trans lesbian and has a lot of poems about gender identity, and it's very raw and emotional and moving, and I don't think you're ever going to be lost or left out of the meaning in this collection. So I will recommend it once again. We'll see if this is even the last time I mention this collection. Probably not. This would be, I mean, unless you are transphobic or homophobic, this would be my recommendation for most people who are just getting into poetry. And if you are transphobic and homophobic, you're not going to enjoy poetry. I've got some bad news. Anyways, and also stop watching my, just go away. Next we have, I think, a much lesser known poet in general than most on this list, and one of my personal favorites, Anna Moshovakis. We have You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake, and what's this one? They have long names. I have not been able to get through to everyone. I definitely can't guarantee that anyone and everyone will enjoy these. What I can guarantee is that you'll probably understand them, because on a sentence level, she's just not doing anything too crazy with syntax. We have a lot of full sentences. It's very easy to understand. I would recommend You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake to people who enjoy history, and I would recommend I've Not Been Able to Get Through to Everyone for people who want to read about maybe depression, mental illness, things like that. Definitely not for everyone, but she is for me. Next, I would recommend Rachel Zucker, and particularly Museum of Accidents. That is a collection very much about motherhood and parenting. It's a little more challenging than some of the books I've mentioned so far, but it's very rewarding if you can put in that effort, and I think it's just a matter of taste. She has very long lines in this collection. You can actually tell by, I'll try to put a picture of the book, I don't own it. You can tell by the shape of the book, you know, most poetry collections and books are shaped like this, and Museum of Accidents is shaped like this because she has such long lines. And it's a very narrative, again, sort of personal, confessional collection, and I think it's just very accessible for that reason. Again, if you like prose, if you're a prose reader, if you like fiction, then Rachel Zucker's collection might be a little bit more of a pathway to poetry for you. Next, let's talk about Molly McCully Brown again. The Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. I made a whole video about this, so I'm not going to say too much except to say that this is like horror, which is the only poetry collection I can say made me feel quite like this. It's pretty narrative, it has characters, it has poems from different perspectives, so if you're more of a fiction person, if you prefer novels, this might be a good inroad to poetry for you. And if you want to hear more about it, you can watch that full-length video where I read some of my favorite passages. Now let's talk about some poets who kind of blend genre a little bit. I would recommend Claudia Rankine's Citizen and American Lyric. Personally, I would classify that as like hybrid poetry. I think it has some real elements of essay writing, nonfiction. There's a lot of full sentences, again, prose poems, and so for people who are new to poetry, I just think it's a good place to start. You're definitely not going to feel left out. Definitely a good place to start if you want something pretty straightforward but still very emotionally moving. Now let's talk about Eve Ewing. I've actually only read Electric Arches, but I should look into her other collections because I really, really loved it, and I think it could be pretty accessible for a similar reason, which is that there's some prose poetry, she's blending genre a little bit, she draws in elements of fantasy and magical realism along with realism, so if those are genres you enjoy, you'll probably like this collection. Finally, the last poet I'm going to recommend is James Tate, and specifically his prose poems. So The Ghost Soldiers is a collection of prose poetry. He's the only poet in my contemporary section who's actually technically not contemporary. He's no longer living, he passed away. I'm not sure how many years ago, but was writing fairly recently. These poems are very weird. They're very absurd, so if you don't like that about poetry, this is not going to solve the problem for you. But if it's the sentence structure that maybe feels a little difficult, this is very easy to understand. There's actually a lot of dialogue in these poems, which is really rare and I think really cool. James Tate is another poet who I really like listening to read aloud. I listened to one of his readings in that UPenn website, and it was really, really funny. It actually reminded me a lot of Stephen Wright, the comedian. So if you like funny poems, if you like things that are funny in an absurd way, this is for you. Thematically, I read it a while ago, but I remember a lot of poems about people talking past each other, isolation, alienation, couples who aren't really hearing one another speak. If that's your thing, I recommend it. So again, my taste is not going to be everyone's taste, but if you do like the sort of things that I like, I'd recommend following me on Goodreads, because you can just go straight to my poetry shelf and you can see my ratings and get more recommendations there. Finally, as always, I do have a Patreon if you'd like more content. On the highest tier, you can send me a poem a month and I'll give you feedback. If you have a full manuscript, I also do manuscript consulting. And if you'd like to read some of my poetry, I have my chapbook linked in the description of this video and most of my videos, so you can purchase that and support me and make me very happy. Thanks for watching. Bye.